These are in listen-only mode.
Good morning and welcome to the April 2014 edition of the Kauffman FastTrac Author Series. My name is Alana Mueller and I'm the president of Kauffman FastTrac, and I welcome you. This morning we're in for a real treat. Robert Stephen Kaplan is the Martin Marshall Professor of Management Practice in the Business Administration and Senior Associate Dean for External Relations at Harvard Business School. He is also co-chairman of Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation, a global venture philanthropy firm, as well as chairman and a founding partner of Indaba Capital Management, LLC. He is the author of several case studies, articles, and 2 recently published books, including What You're Really Meant to Do, A Roadmap for Reaching Your Unique Potential, and What to Ask the Person in the Mirror, critical questions for becoming a more effective leader and reaching your potential. Prior to joining Harvard Business School in September 2005, Rob served as vice chairman of the Goldman Sachs Group with oversight responsibility for the investment banking and investment management divisions. He was also a member of the firm's management committee and served as co-chairman of the firm's partnership committee and chairman of the Goldman Sachs Pine Street Leadership Program. During his career at the firm, he also served in various other capacities and became a partner in 1990. Rob is the senior director of the firm to this day. In What You're Really Meant to Do, Rob provides a much-needed roadmap for redefining success and reaching your own unique potential. Analogous to his guidance on leadership, this quest also requires a process, a high level of motivation, and a lot of hard work. On a personal note, Rob is a longtime friend and someone who I greatly admire. I hope you'll join me in welcoming Robert Stephen Kaplan to the Kauffman FastTrac Author Series. Rob, take it away.
Thank you, Alana, and great to be with you all. It's always a pleasure to work with Alana and follow her great success. So I'm going to talk for 35 minutes, and I guess I'm going to start with the following. You heard a little bit of my background. I was at Goldman Sachs. I actually know Alana because I'm from Kansas City, and Alana grew up in Kansas City, and so did I. And when I go around the country, or I go home to Kansas City, and I tell people that I'm now a professor at Harvard Business School, people have a very excited reaction. They're very impressed, blah, blah, blah. All sounds good. Then they usually follow up after a minute or so and ask me, what do you teach? And I very enthusiastically tell them that I teach leadership. Now, that second part about what I teach, when I say the word leadership, it's usually met with a blank stare. They're like, look at me dumbfounded. And it used to really unnerve me. And they'd say things like, oh, I don't think you can teach that. Or, oh, what is that? And I'd say to them, oh, of course you can teach it. And, I feel strongly you can teach it. And leaders, I haven't met a leader yet who didn't have to learn. And so after protesting that way, they usually say to me, well, fine, tell me in 30 seconds or so, what it is you teach, or, what are the 5 big points. So normally at the end of these kind of conversations, I leave feeling very depressed. And it finally occurred to me after a number of years that part of the reason for this discussion is nobody actually knows what leadership is. Now you'd say, no, that's not possible. That's not possible, because we're talking about leadership all the time. We say there's a leadership crisis in this country. Every CEO, including me, says, I want more leaders in my company. And most of us want to be a leader. But what I've learned is, and I've done this, if you do a little test with 100 leaders, 100 CEOs, you pick the audience and ask them to define and write down on a piece of paper their definition of the term leadership, you'd be shocked with the variation of what you would hear back. There is no consensus on what it is. Some people say it's about inspiring others. It's about charisma. It's about getting others to follow you. Others would say, no, that's the old way of thinking about leadership. Being a leader is being a servant to your people. Then there's a group of other people who would say, all that's nonsense, that qualitative stuff. Let me tell you, I have one question for you. Are you making money? If you're a politician, are you winning re-election? If you're not making money, you're not a leader. If you're making money, you're a leader. You're probably a pretty good leader. If you're a politician and you're getting reelected, you must be a pretty good leader. In other words, there's a lot of people out there, because they're not sure exactly what leadership is. They judge it based on outcomes, based on metrics. So what I've tried to do over the last 5 or 6 years is demystify leadership and make it accessible to people. Why? Because it's a problem, I realize, that people don't know what leadership is. I work with nonprofit leaders through Draper Richards Kaplan, and the biggest thing we have to do is sort of bring down to planet Earth a definition of the term leadership, so we can break it down into actions, into what you're supposed to do, as opposed to some lofty concept that you either are a leader or you're not a leader. So what I'm going to talk about today is try to bring leadership down to planet Earth and break it down in a way that you can actually act on. And so on that point, which is, and I'll skip this first slide, so what the heck is leadership? I figured after all these years, given there was so much disagreement, I can't do any damage to the field, or more damage, by coming up with my own definition. So I've come up with my own. Leadership, to me, at its essence, requires these first 3 points. And let me talk through them. Number 1, leaders figure out what they believe as if they were the owner, as if they were in charge. Now, this is harder than it sounds. And you may be thinking yourself as you're listening, what's so big about this? Many people out there have opinions. The TV channels and radio is full of people with opinions about what leaders ought to do. That's not leadership, though. Leadership is putting yourself in the seat and assuming anything you want to happen can happen. No excuses about, oh, gee, I don't have the power and no one will listen to me, or I'm not. No, you've got the power now. Think as if you were in charge. You have the power. What do you believe? Now, this is a very hard thing to do, and because, number one, a lot of people don't put themselves and think about what they would do in this mindset as if they were in charge. This takes analysis. It probably takes getting advice from other people. It takes a lot of striving, agonizing. Most of us, including me, spend half our lives trying to figure out what we believe in certain situations, and I will tell you that most leaders spend a lot of their time not knowing exactly what they believe. My point is not that you need to always have the answer to this question if you're a leader, but what I am saying, leaders are always striving to answer this question, always striving in everything they're doing. What do I believe? Now, this includes if you're a subordinate or you're just a bystander out there. What do I believe should be done? As if I were in a position to do it. So that's step one. Leaders are always thinking this way and striving to figure out what they believe as if they actually were in the position to make it happen. Okay? That's number one thing a leader does. Number two, leaders eventually and ultimately take action. The world is full of lots of people who think they know what they believe if they were in charge, but have a million reasons why they won't act. I will tell you, in my business career and nonprofit career, and even my leadership job now, I've been involved in many decisions that ultimately had terrible outcomes, got all screwed up. I felt bad about it. And the people on the team that I decided with came up to me afterward. There's always somebody that comes up afterwards and says, you know, I knew that would never work. Or, you know, I never agreed with that. And naturally, my first reaction is to try to choke them to death. As I'm trying to suffocate them, I'm asking them, why didn't you speak up? Why didn't you say something? If you felt so strongly, why didn't you? And you were in all the meetings. You acted like you agreed. Why didn't you say something? And there's always, the reasons are always things like, oh, I didn't think you would listen, or I didn't, you seemed like you had your mind made up, or I didn't think I had any power, or people who are not leaders have a million reasons why they can't act. Now, acting may be as simple as speaking up, which is not so easy to do, particularly to your boss. It may be more complicated, like coming up with an action plan and working through other people. But what the point is, leaders strive to figure out how to take what they believe and turn it into action. They're not bystanders. They take action. Third thing a leader does, they do number one and number two. They figure out what they believe as if they were in charge. They take action. They figure out a way to act appropriately. But number three, in a way that adds value to others, to a customer, to a client, to a community, to a country, to a child, to a citizen. There are lots of people in this world who can figure out what they believe is good for them and can act on it. But in my opinion, that's not leadership. Leadership, in my view, always requires one more thing, and that is, are you acting in a way that adds value to someone else? And I will tell you that I've seen industries, I've seen CEOs, I've seen government leaders who get themselves in trouble because they lose sight of this third point. They think it's all about winning re-election. They think it's all about making money. What they learn ultimately, and what great leaders know and learn, is that adding value to others, if you do that consistently over a period of time, that will lead to making money or getting reelected or good outcomes. And you have to act if that were the case. Money is, in my career, is an outcome that comes as a result of consistently adding value to others. I've seen people make money for a year or two not adding value, but not over a sustainable period of time. Okay, so these are the three big points. If you are in an environment where you are a leader, the fourth thing a leader does is create an environment where people do 1, 2, and 3. You empower others to do the same. And I will tell you consistently, great companies, great nonprofits, great organizations of all kinds, great schools, you name it, are built around people who act this way. This is what makes the difference between a mediocre company and a great company, in my opinion, is this kind of mindset. You develop people and train people and empower people to act like owners, to think like owners, to have the guts and the wherewithal to act, and thirdly, in a way that adds value to others. Okay, so by the way, by this definition, you don't need to manage anybody to be a leader, okay? On the flip side, you could manage thousands and thousands of people and not be a leader at all. You might be a good manager, but not a leader. I was giving a talk in Delaware about 6 weeks ago, and I was introduced before I spoke by a grade school principal who told a story of leadership before I got up. And she told a story about a child in the school that previous week. A child in the school, a little 5-year-old child, had wet his pants. It happens. A janitor, probably the most junior person in that whole school, lowest title, a janitor saw the child and saw the child was in distress, having wet his pants, took it upon himself to go get a teacher, and together that janitor and the teacher worked with the child to get him cleaned up. They somehow found him a change of clothes. They didn't want to put him through the humiliation of sending him home because they know that would be traumatic, and they somehow got that child back into class and got him back on his way without putting him through a tremendous trauma. That janitor is a leader. He's got a title that doesn't suggest he's a leader, but the point is that janitor is a leader, and I'm pretty darn sure that that principal creates an environment in that school where that janitor felt empowered to act, and that principal is a leader. Leadership is not about your position. You don't need a written invitation to be a leader. There are millions of leaders, in my opinion, in this world and in this country every day. Single mother, policeman or woman, military person, entrepreneur, you name it. You don't need an invitation to do it. You don't need to wait to get in a position to do it. You can do this today. You can think about what you would do if you were in charge. You can act on it. in a way that adds value to others. And if you are responsible for other people, you can create an environment that encourages others to do the same. That, to me, is leadership. Okay, so, sounds simple enough. In fact, oh my God, that's leadership, huh? That doesn't sound that complicated. So why in the world do leaders fail? It doesn't sound that hard. And here's what I've learned. I used to think that people failed to act like leaders because they weren't smart enough, or they weren't, a lot of reasons that I realize now may not be the case. Here's the biggest reasons I find people fail to act like leaders. Number one, in order to figure out what you believe and act on it, you're seldom going to be able to do this alone, and you seldom are going to be able to know how to do it. You've got to learn to ask a question. You have to be a little bit of a student. You have to assume you don't have all the answers, because leaders never do. The world is too complicated to figure out what you believe. You have to study. You have to be willing to inquire. You have to be willing to get the views of others. A lot of people, though, think that that's a sign of weakness to ask a question. I talk to a lot of CEOs who are struggling as leaders, and I ask them, how often do you get advice from your people? How often do you solicit advice? And they say, oh, I can't do that. You crazy? That's going to make me look like a weakling. And what they don't realize is walking around every day and being isolated and showing an inability to learn, that makes you look weak. Asking a question, trying to learn, showing a willingness to learn, that actually, it's counterintuitive to some people. I believe that makes you stronger. So the second thing that's related to this is isolation. If you are in a position of responsibility of some kind, and you don't ask questions, and you are not open to learning, I believe you are going to become isolated. And I see this every single week when people come to me for advice. They are much more isolated than they realize. They have blind spots. They're struggling to figure out what they believe and act on it because they can't see things. And the reason is we all have blind spots. If you don't seek advice from others and ask questions and share information about what you're thinking about, you are going to be isolated. And most people I talk to are far more isolated than they realize, to the point that everyone around them knows they have a problem, everybody, that is, but them. And the question for you on this call is that if you're not asking questions and seeking advice from people, subordinates, people you work with, people outside, I think you may find that everybody around you knows that there is a problem, everybody but you. Leaders have to be willing to ask questions, have to be open to learning, and in order to do that, the last part, you have to be willing, to accept some degree of vulnerability and discomfort and being yourself. You can't walk around. A lot of people think, because nobody knows what leadership is, a lot of people think it is, I have all the answers. I decide. That's what some people think it is. It's John Wayne, let's go north. What they don't realize, there is a time for that, but there's also a time for you to gather information, seek advice, inquire, study, do analysis, which may cause you, if you're a certain type of person, may cause you to feel a little vulnerable because you think as a leader, I'm supposed to have all the answers. Leadership is about asking the right questions much more than having all the answers. And a lot of people don't get that. And I think part of it is because they're not sure what the heck leadership is. They mimic what they see in others, but they're not sure. Okay, so, and I'm not going to go too deep with this today, but there are two processes. If you buy into this is what a leader does, figure out what you believe as if you're in charge, act on it in a way that adds value to others. I would argue there are two processes you need to pursue. And the tricky part, you have to do them both in parallel. That's what makes this so darn hard. The first one I would call vision, priorities, and alignment, okay? And what I mean by that is whatever your position, whatever you're doing, I would argue everyone on this call needs to have an aspiration or a vision. And by the way, it's not some highfalutin term. What it means is, how do I, or how do we, how does our group, how does our company, how does our unit, how do we add value that's distinctive? How do we add value to a customer or client, and how is it distinctive? This is, I said leadership is about asking the right questions. If you run a nonprofit or a business unit of any kind, this is a question you got to be asking, I would argue, regularly. Why? Because if you're adding value today, or you're trying to add value today in the same way you did 2 or 3 years ago, likely you're out of date. The world is becoming more global. Technology is changing. There's disruptive innovation constantly. You've got to keep updating what you do and how you add value, or else it's no longer distinctive. Products and services get commoditized. If you're a leader, I would argue the most important question that leaders I work with fail to ask but need to ask is, how do we add value to a customer or client that's distinctive? And I would say that people on this call, if you're running something or you're a leader of some kind, you ought to be able to write this down. How do we add value to who and what in a way that's distinctive? What do we do that's distinctive? And I would argue, even at Harvard Business School, I'm a senior associate dean here. When I talk to the dean, this is the question we're asking constantly. Why? Because the world is changing, and this is why we're coming up with new ways to teach, online education, new ways to interact with our students, new ways to act with alumni. Why? Because we need to keep updating how we add value, or else we're going to wake up one day and find out we don't add any distinctive value at all. Okay, so that's question number one. What is your vision for how you add value? What's the aspiration? What are you trying to do? Based on that, if you're a leader, you need to pick 3 to 5 priorities. And what I mean by that is priorities is tasks that you must do well in order to add that value. So for example, in my former job and running investment banking at Goldman, one of them was attracting and retaining and developing the best people. If we're gonna serve clients, we've got to have great people, and I spend an enormous amount of time recruiting and training and coaching people. Another one is to have relationships with clients, and spend an enormous amount of time, therefore, interacting with clients, going out and meeting clients, understanding their needs. Those are examples of 2 priorities. Priorities are tasks that you must do well if you're going to add that value. I would argue, if you're a leader, you need to be asking this question all the time. What are our priorities? Are we spending our time on our priorities? And you need to be talking with your people and making sure you're on the same page about your priorities, because your priorities are the things that you spend your time on. And then the rest of your life as a leader is what I would call alignment, which we could talk for hours about, but I'll just mention, you're making a million decisions every day, big ones and little ones, and the question, they should all be made through the prism of how do we add value, and what are our top 3 or 4 priorities. And every decision you make, who do we hire? How do we pay them? How should we sit? How should I spend my time? How should we organize ourselves? Your leadership style. Should I be on this conference call on FastTrac or not? Every decision you make should be in the back of your mind through the prism of, will it help me add value, or will it help our organization add this value that's distinctive and accomplish priorities, or will it undermine it? And so you need to be asking, a lot of the discussion I have with leaders is what is your vision, what are your priorities, and how are you in alignment and how are you out of alignment? And again, these are questions. My experience is, as a leader, if you're asking these questions and you're engaging your people in these questions, and then ultimately coming to some conclusion about what you believe on these points, and your people are empowered to do the same, you've got a great chance to build just a fantastic organization. But this is a process. Now, I'll mention, I talked about this process. I'm going to talk about a second process here in a second, but these are processes that never have a conclusion. Leadership, figuring out what you believe, acting on it in a way that adds value, is like losing weight or getting in shape, is the best analogy I can use. You never finish. You're always striving. You would never lose 20 pounds and say, now I can eat whatever I want. You have to work at it your entire life. Same as getting in shape. These are questions. Vision, priority, alignment are questions that you need to be asking regularly, and you never finish. There's a second process, though, which is a little more challenging for many people, and for some people more threatening, in that you have to understand vision, priorities, alignment, and be asking those questions, but you have to understand, you have to pursue one other process. You have to understand yourself. And this is a process that never ends, because you're always going to have to be working at this. As you get promoted, as your industry changes, as your job changes, as you change your life, as you get older, you are changing. Your strengths and weaknesses, do you know what they are relative to the job you're in? What are your passions? Do you know? What is your story? What is your life story? How does it affecting you? And particularly, I won't talk as much today, but in particular, there are a bunch of stories you tell yourself. There's the facts of your life. There's your big success story, which is the one you tell most people about yourself. And then there's a third story, which I would call your failure narrative. And this is the one you don't tell anybody, but it's in your head. And for many people, this failure narrative, self-doubt, is what ultimately keeps you from doing vision, priorities, alignment, and being an effective leader and adapting a leadership style that's effective. Do you know what your failure narrative is? Are you aware of it? For many people, if you've been fired, if you had a traumatic relationship with one or more of your parents, something that happened, and maybe you trusted someone and they betrayed you, all these things stay with you whether you know it or not. And what a leader does is be open to asking the questions of themselves and learning about themselves, and obviously about your values and boundaries. But all this feeds into what is your leadership style. One of the most powerful forces you have to align with your vision is your style. But in order to do this, you have to figure out who you are. So I wrote a book on the first process, vision, priorities, alignment. I wrote my last book on this process, understanding yourself. We could talk for hours about both, but my point is they both have one thing in common. They require you to ask questions, to be open to learning, not only about intellectual matters, but also learning about yourself. And this second process, in my experience, is where people shut down. Otherwise, very capable people get to a point where they are not open to learning. They don't want to feel vulnerable. They're not open to seeking advice. They just don't want to go there. And I would argue that to be a leader, you have to be open to learning about yourself as well as intellectual matters. And yes, it goes on at age 25, 45, 65, and yes, 85. Everyone out there wants to make an impact. Most people I know, it's not age dependent. You've got to be open to learning, and these are two processes that I think you have to pursue. Now, so given this little spiel, so what are you supposed to do now? I would say, for starters, my main objective, at least in this brief talk, is to try to change your mind a little bit, your mindset about your conception of leadership. Leadership is not a state of being. It's not a destination. It is a process. Okay, it's a process, and you got to strive always to figure out what do you have conviction about. Act on it in a way that adds value. And like any process, the more you pursue it, the better you get at it. As you go through this process on vision, priorities, and alignment, and understanding yourself, you're going to develop muscles that maybe you don't have or you've let atrophy. You're going to get in shape. And like getting in shape, a lot of times, it may not feel good to some of you to do some of these things. Second thing I'd say, so I'd say you need to take ownership of being a leader. What is your definition of success? What do you want to do? What is your aspiration? And I would argue you need to act like an owner of it. And by the way, you should create an environment where your people feel ownership of it. Second, I don't think you can become a leader all by yourself or pursue these processes. You need feedback. And one of the issues I have with people, I find, is they think they're getting feedback through mentors. And let me differentiate mentoring versus coaching. Mentoring means I tell you a story. You give me advice based on my story. The problem is your advice back to me is only as good as my story, and my story has blind spots. Coaching, on the other hand, is different than mentoring, in my opinion. It requires direct observation. And the best thing I can liken it to that help people understand this is in a sport. If any of you on this call play golf or play tennis or play any sport in your life, imagine getting on the phone and talking to a golf coach or a tennis coach or a football coach and describing how you block or tackle or hit a golf ball or your swing. I mean, you'd say that's laughable. They can't understand it. And I can't describe accurately what I do because I don't see it fully. Versus that person watching me hit a golf ball or block or tackle or do whatever the sport is, then all of a sudden they can see things I don't see. I assure you leadership is the exact same thing. People who observe you every day see things about what you're doing that you don't see or can't see. Blind spots, we all have them. Mentoring won't get at that, because your story, your narrative, has those blind spots embedded. So what you have to learn to do if you want to take 100% ownership of learning to be a leader, you have to learn to solicit coaching from people that observe you. And for many of you, if you're very senior, that means your subordinates. If you're more junior, it means soliciting coaching from people around you, maybe more senior or peers. But you've got to get in the habit early in your career, as early as possible, of seeking feedback. And I used to do this regularly, and I still do it. I'd sit with a person. I'd meet with junior people regularly, one-on-one, and I would ask them, is there one thing that I could do to improve? And when you're in charge, you're going to find this is what happens. Their response is, nope, nothing I can think of. And so I sit there with them, and I say, no, I'm really serious. I really want feedback on something I could do better. They look at you. They start thinking whether this is some type of weird, perverse loyalty test, which they don't want to flunk, and they don't know what to do. And if you stay with it, though, they will eventually give you a piece of feedback. They'll regret it, by the way, as soon as they say it. Why? Because it's going to be devastating to you. You'll try not to act devastated. You'll thank them. They'll leave. You'll then probably call home and talk to a friend or loved one and ask them, you know, is this really what I'm like? And they'll say, yeah, that does sound like you. And you'll realize you have a hell of a problem, and you've got to go fix it. What that does, though, is, A, you've gotten good feedback and you're on your way to fixing it. B, that person you sought advice from will learn that you're open to feedback, and they'll be more likely to give you feedback in the future. And what happens is you're not isolated anymore as much. You're not alone. You can puncture the isolation and clear up some of your blind spots, but you've got to get coaching to do it. And so I believe you need to, if you want to be a leader, you got to learn to get coaching early. You also need to be willing to get feedback in advance of your year-end review. And if you're coaching others, you have to give feedback well in advance of the year-end review. The year-end review is not the time to get coached because it's too late. It's the verdict. You know, your comp or promotion is already set. Coaching has to happen well in advance of a year-end review where there's time to act. And so my question for all of you on this call, if you believe this is what leadership is, and you believe there are these two processes, my question for you, though, is you don't need to feel like you can master all this right now, and you don't even have to feel right now that you can do it, but you do need to be open to learning. Are you open to learning about vision, priorities, and alignment, to thinking through and getting advice and learning about how do you add value that's distinctive, setting priorities? And most importantly, are you open to learning about yourself? I think once you make the leap to saying, yeah, I want to take ownership of this, and I'm going to be open to learning because I want to own this, I think for many people, this is the breakthrough they make, that they can make in terms of being leaders. And what you learn is you don't need a written invitation to be a leader. You can be a leader right where you're sitting right now. It's not something I'll do someday when such and such happens. All of you are in a position today to think this way, to act this way, no matter how much power or influence you have. Like the janitor in that grade school, nobody sent him an invitation, and if he didn't help that child, nobody would have faulted him. But that janitor decided he wanted to be a leader. He wanted to think like an owner and act like one in a way that added value. And I bet that janitor enjoys his job a lot more, and that's a great school because of his leadership. So this is a house. You may ask, what's this about? This is about taking ownership of it. You own it. And for a lot of people say, oh, yeah, I want to own it. Really? Means if you're going to own it, you have to be willing to endure a little bit of discomfort, use new muscles, learn new habits, and follow this process rigorously, not for 3 days or 3 years, but I think it's a process you want to pursue the rest of your life. You're going to have to work at it, because once you think you got it, something changes, and you got to keep working at it. And I think if you do, though, you're going to I don't know how much power, prestige, or money, or any of those other things you're going to have, but I think you're going to be very satisfied with your progress in reaching your potential and making a real impact on the world. So let me stop there, and let's go to questions.
Rob, thank you so much. Wonderful presentation, and I think so many insights that all of us can use. We do have several questions already. I will offer up to our audience, which is pretty sizable at this moment. If you have questions, please enter them into the questions field on your webinar dashboard, and Rob will answer as many questions as we have time for. So, Rob, there have been several questions related to this notion of the year-end review, and we have many entrepreneurs who are on the call, and so several have asked, in the context of entrepreneurship and in the context of a year-end review, most entrepreneurs don't get a year-end review. So can we bring it back to entrepreneurship, and how might one seek the type of feedback that you're describing, considering that they are the owners, and in some cases they're a solopreneur?
All right, so I spend the most predominant group I teach, as Alana knows, is owner presidents. So I teach about 1,000 entrepreneurs / owner presidents every year. And what I find on this point is you on this call are naturally, structurally more prone to being isolated. Why? Because first of all, if you're the entrepreneur and you're the founder, anybody who works in your company or your organization, they damn well better get along with you, because if they don't, it's going to be a pretty bleak working experience. They don't have much future at the company. So the danger is the people maybe who started with you are used to speaking up to you, but maybe as you get bigger and you have new people join, they're going to want to make sure not to upset you or to have you think they're stupid. And so there's a huge power asymmetry between the boss, in your case, and the subordinates. And so I would argue, how do you get feedback? The way for you to get feedback is, I would argue, sit down one-on-one individually. Can't do this in a group. Nobody wants to criticize you in front of their peers. Sit down one-on-one, and I would ask a specific question, which is, can you give me one piece of advice on what I could do better? You have to learn, because you have all the power. People, believe me, that work with you have constructive feedback. But if you send off a vibe that you don't want to hear it, they're going to keep their mouth shut, assuming they want to keep working at this company, because they got to get along with you. So you have all the power. Recognize that, and you have to be the one to open the door and ask the question. And then when somebody gives you advice, reinforce them for at least giving you advice. Now, that's understanding. You may not agree with the advice, and you may not follow the advice. That's okay, but you have to ask. You're the one who can put the key in the door. Now, as the boss, by the way, but we'll talk about this separately, my advice on the year-end review thing is more for you as the boss. Make sure you're giving coaching to your people well in advance of the year-end review. You don't want to surprise your subordinates. You in particular, you don't want to surprise them in the year-end review. You want to coach them during the year so that when you get to the year-end review, it's more confirming what you've already been talking to them about. You don't want to surprise, when you surprise somebody in the year-end review, particularly if you're an owner, president, or an entrepreneur, and they're shocked by the criticism, they're going to start thinking they don't know you, they don't understand you, and a little bit maybe they don't trust you. And I think that can be very destabilizing when you're an entrepreneur trying to build an organization.
Great advice, Rob. Thank you. Another question that came early in the presentation, you talked a lot about asking questions and asking the right questions. And so one of our audience members asked this. She said, so what's the suggested ratio between asking questions and having answers? Is it primarily situational? And if so, what are some examples?
Well, yes, it's situational. Let's face it. For those who are on this call, if you're entrepreneurs and you've already led a venture, start a venture, my guess is you got lots of answers. I don't think I need to coach you on that, on not being for many of you, that is. Most entrepreneurs or owner presidents I meet with don't have a problem that you're not assertive enough or not directive enough. But maybe there are some people who aren't. Here's my comment on that for you. My fear is you're so directive, and because you want to show you're a leader. And by the way, this happens to people maybe take over from a parent running a business. You want to show you can measure up to your father or your mother or whatever, and you may take it too far is the bigger risk. And so my only question for you, and only you can know because you live your life, do you seek advice? Do you ask opinions of others? Do you ask questions? There is clearly a lot of the time as a leader you need to say we're going to do this, this, and this. But I think you need to make sure to give voice to your people. Are you empowering your people? Do you treat them like their owners? Do you encourage them to act like owners? And the reason I'd say you're just going to have to monitor that is the danger for an entrepreneur is that you find yourself all alone. And I hear this from entrepreneurs all the time. No one cares about this business as much as I do. Damn it, what's wrong with these people? Well, part of it may be you're not treating them like owners or partners. Are you sharing information with them? Do you ever seek their advice? And I think the biggest issue I often find with entrepreneurs is you're lonely and isolated, and you feel like nobody cares as much with you, and it makes you crazy. And I think you need to step back and think about, are you empowering and seeking advice and giving voice to your people, so you put them in a position to step up and make it so it's not all on you.
That's great. Thank you. A little different topic now, talking about the failure narrative. And the person who asked the question, he really understood that, and it seemed right on. So he asks, please say more about what exercises and work we can do around the failure narrative to face it and to free ourselves from its power and more fully engage in the vision, priorities, and alignment work that you described. Okay,
so and I talk about this in my book. Normally what I have people do is the following. When you have a free moment, take out a piece of paper and write down 3 stories. And this is all about awareness, by the way. I'm not a shrink or a psychiatrist, and I have my own failure narrative, and I don't think I'm going to get rid of it. But the purpose of this exercise I'm about to say is to be aware of how it's affecting my behavior. So write down the facts of your life. That should be not controversial. Where you were born. I was born in Kansas City. My father's a traveling salesman. My mother's a real estate agent. I went to the University of Kansas. so on and so forth. I went to Goldman Sachs, I blah, 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 and go through the facts of your life. Fine. That's one story. And for some people, by the way, even that can be illuminating. There's a second story, which on this one I don't care if you write out as much, but maybe bullet points, and this I would call your success narrative. And the reason I say I don't care about this as much, this is a story I believe, whether you know it or not, you got so much practice at writing this story, I don't need to give you any more practice. This is the story you tell people when you meet them in business or at a cocktail reception. And by the way, most people, when they tell this story, it's, by the way, there's setbacks in the story. You know, I was fired, and it was devastating. But then you come back and say, but you know what? Now I realize it was the best thing that ever happened to me. It's always an upbeat story, even when there's setbacks. And the punchline is normally the same with you as the hero of the story. And most people, particularly if you're an entrepreneur, have a story like this when you're raising money, when you're trying to get people to work with you. Okay, fine. There's a third story, and the only thing I would try to do is write it down. And this is about, there's a few ways we go at this. Think of an injustice to get at you and to spark your thinking. When was there injustice done in your life? When did you feel like you were treated unfairly? It was traumatic. What were the facts of it? And the big question is, how did you frame it then? How do you frame it today? And the big one, how is it affecting your behavior today? And for a lot of people, when I ask this injustice question, their first reaction is, I can't think of one. I mean, I'm sorry, Rob, I can't think of one. Then they stop and think for a few more minutes, and then they think of one. And then they get really upset, you know, angry. So a lot of people, including me, submerge these injustices in your life and take a while. So give yourself a chance to think about it and write about it. But the big question ultimately is, how have you framed it? But how is it affecting your behavior today? The other exercise we do is, what were traumatic experiences, or we call crucibles, in your life? You know, defining experiences, traumatic experiences. Same question. How do you think it affects your behavior today? And so these little prongs, I think, ideally help you write your, what you're trying to get out of this is ultimately writing, what is your self-doubt narrative? What do you think you can't do? I can't confront people. You know, I can't speak in front of a group of 1,000 people, which is one I used to have. I can't do this. I can't do that. I'm no good at this. I'm no good at that. What are those no goods, and where did they come from? And what you try to do and work at this is try to just be aware of it. Then the big question is, how is this failure narrative, or these injustices, or these traumas, how do they affect your leadership style? And for some of you, it may be, I don't trust people. I don't like to share information. I'm very guarded. Why? Because I had a bad experience. I was betrayed once. You know, I don't know what it is, but I think you should ask, how is it affecting your leadership style for better? And how is it affecting your leadership style for worse? How is it undermining your effectiveness? And that's what I'd suggest working at.
Great. Our next question is about corporate culture. And so the person says, talk about corporate culture where speaking up and acting can produce punitive actions from the people who can impact a person's career.
Okay, so this is a good one. And this is why there are 1,000 reasons not to act, and this is one of them, in that, do you work for a boss, or do you, even worse, you work for a company where your experience has been speaking up will get you smacked around, i.e., you know, you regret it. Okay, so this is a tough one. If you're not the, listen, this is why it's always nice to be the boss, in my experience. But if you're not the boss, there is a huge, to your point, the questioner's point, there's a huge power asymmetry between the boss and the subordinate. And if you're the subordinate, let's face it, your boss has power, so you're going to have to, A, try to find ways to effectively give feedback to or speak up to the boss. But in fairness, if your boss consistently sends you messages, I don't want you to speak up, I want you to keep your mouth shut, then you have, in my opinion, you have a decision to make then. How is this affecting your own development? And maybe at some stage of your career, you can live with not being able to speak up because you're learning a lot of other things. But I would argue if your aspiration is to ultimately be a leader, you may reach a crossroads where if that really is the culture of your company or that's the attitude of your boss, you may have to move or go do something else so you can bloom. This is why, by the way, I always encourage people, in addition to your professional work, volunteer on a nonprofit board, get involved in another activity so that if you can't bloom at work for periods because your boss got a rotten boss, you can bloom on a nonprofit board. But ultimately, if you're in a culture that discourages it consistently, you're going to have to ask yourself a question at a certain point, how is this impeding your development?
That's great advice. I love that, and I think that that's certainly something that everybody on this call can relate to, whether they're the boss or the subordinate. So great advice. The next question talks about the execution of the parallel processes that you described. So they say, can you please explain how to execute the parallel processes? In other words, vision, priorities, and alignment versus you and your strengths, etc., versus your leadership style.
Okay, so here's and this is pathetic what I'm about to say. So it only took me about 6 or 7 years to figure out how to do the first process, which is I finally wrote this first book, I forget what year, 2011 I guess it was. And then I had been giving the speech on the second process for literally 15 years. So I guess it took me 15 years to figure out how to write the book on the second process. So there are, I'm not going to give you a snippy, quick 30-second answer. My best advice, and that's the part that's pathetic, I actually would say read the books and look at those processes, because here's why. And I'm happy to send them to you. So you don't have to buy them. But there's a series of steps that what I try to do with vision, priorities, and alignment and understanding yourself is break it down into manageable steps. When I used to hear the term vision back 15 years ago when I was running a business, all it did is make me freeze because I didn't know what the hell it meant. I didn't know how to do it, and blah, I just forget about it. So what I've tried to do is break it down into action steps. And so for every one of these points, how do you add value that's distinctive? There's a series and a protocol of questions that I break down to go through vision, to go through priorities, to go through alignment, and to go through a lot of other points related to them. And my best advice, just like, again, losing weight or getting in shape, I can't mention one thing you should do to lose weight on this phone call here right now, but I could say there's 7 or 8 things I think you should do. Let's look at your diet. Let's look at carbohydrates versus protein, blah, blah, blah. There's a bunch of steps. This is similar to that. And so I would say don't try to swallow it the same way I wouldn't say just don't go out there and lose 20 pounds. You got to figure out a process. And I would say either my books or some other way, but there are literally 7 or 8 or 9 steps for each. And some will resonate with you, some you'll be better at with others, and you just got to practice them, and you'll get in shape to do this stuff. But that's the best way I would recommend pursuing it.
Rob, the next person asks, what are the best coaching options? Professional coaches, superiors, family, friends, etc.
Okay, so I start off with the premise that coaching, as we've talked, requires direct observation. So then you go to next question. Okay, fair enough, I get you. So who observes me regularly? It might be family. It might be subordinates. It might be superiors. And I would say make a list of 4 or 5 people that you have a relationship with, that you think you can trust, that you think you understand, who care about you, and you're willing to confide in, and talk with them and seek feedback from those people. Now, what I've done many times in my career with people that I've worked with is they really just can't when they go through that process I just talked about, it's a null set. They just can't seem to identify people that observe them that they're willing to confide in. So for those people, I have said, let's go get you an outside coach. What the outside coach will do is they'll go interview 15 people around you, including those people on your list, and they will ask them the same questions you would ask, and then they would feed that feedback back to you so you hear it. I think if you're stuck and you can afford to hire an outside coach, that's a way to get you jump-started. My only caveat is you can't do that for the rest of your life. That's a Band-Aid. But if that's what you need to do to get jump-started, by all means do it. But ultimately, you have to learn and be willing to have relationships and be vulnerable enough to face-to-face seek advice or feedback from people. And that may be just a matter of practicing it. I found people don't think they can do it until they do it. And then they say, oh, my Lord, I can do this. And sometimes I've even, with people, given them interview questions to ask and say, here's 5 questions. I want you to take these questions. If they sound stupid to you or you feel like an idiot asking them, blame Rob Kaplan. He gave it to me. He made me do it. And ask people. And they realize, wow, well, I wish I'd done that 10 years ago. So that's my advice on that, I guess.
That's great. That's great. This next question, the question is, can you offer clarity between leadership and management? And I remember, and I think you and I have even spoken about this before, when I was at Sprint, we used to talk about which comes first, management or leadership. And I loved your story about the janitor and his ability to step up as a leader, which required no management skills whatsoever. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of how to show the distinction between the two?
So I always smile on this one, and Alana knows this, because, I mean, and I'm old enough now I can say this, for the last 30 years, I mean, this question comes up all the time. What's the difference between leadership and management? And, it comes up all the time. I ask it, and be honest with you, I've come to a conclusion, hell, I'm not even sure I know anymore, but I'll give you my stab at it. I obviously defined what I think leadership is, okay? So then let me go to what management is. Management is a little bit more making the trains run on time. And so why would somebody be a good manager and not a leader? There are a lot of administrative aspects to the job, even I do now, and the job I did at Goldman Sachs, where I have to check certain things. I have to make sure people are where they're supposed to be. I have to make sure we have good compliance. I have to do a lot of processes. If any of you on this call are on a board of a company, there's all sorts of processes you have to follow and manage, and you make sure that we set up a game plan to execute all these processes. And you have to be organized to do it and all that stuff. So that to me is management. Organization and effective pursuit of various processes and doing them in a workman-like or work-person-like way. Leadership to me is the extra step of what should we do? I mean, forget all the processing of what we're going to do and how we're going to forget how we're going to do it. What should we do? What should we do? But well, I don't really want to worry about what we do. I just want to execute what we're doing. I prefer to execute. Well, no, that's leadership is, but what should we do? And what about how effective is what we're doing? How should we change what we do? And what should our priorities be? And, oh, my God, there's been a lot of changes in the world. Are we still adding value? What do I believe? And so management is a lot less agonizing, although it can be very rigorous and consuming and all that. Leadership is about, in my opinion, agonizing. This is about what do you believe. It's about conviction. Now, you can have conviction on how to perform certain tasks. I got to go shopping. We got to buy groceries. I got to buy milk and eggs and blah, blah, blah. But there's a bigger, broader question about, what do I believe, though, about where we're going? What should we do? And maybe that's not a great, precise way to answer it, but that's the way I'd answer it.
That's great. Rob, it's been such a pleasure to have you this morning. Thank you so much. Always great to talk with you, and I'm delighted that we were able to share this with our FastTrac community. For those of you who joined us by phone, thank you so much for being with us this morning. I hope you'll join us again next month for our FastTrac Author Series. We'll welcome Megan McArdle. She'll talk about her book, The Upside of Down, Why Failing Well is the Key to Success. Wishing you all a great day. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.